Welcome to our weekly conversation on human-computer interaction and the future of work and well-being. I'd like to thank the organizers, so that will be Andrew Kuhn, who's here with us, Linda Boyle, Raffaella Sadun, John Lee, Manfred, Tscheligi, and myself, and to acknowledge National Science Foundation for partially funding this event. The first part of the event will be recorded, and we're very much looking forward to get questions from the audience. So please type them in the chat, and Andrew will monitor the chat for questions and then call on you to ask your question. And stay with us for the second part, which is following the conversation. We will continue with an informal kind of social event. So right now I'd like to welcome Dr. Casey Fiesler. Casey Fiesler is an assistant professor in the Department of Information Science at Colorado University Boulder, with additional affiliations with computer science, Silicon Flatirons at the Law School and the Atlas Institute. She has a PhD in human-centered computing from Georgia Tech and a law degree from Vanderbilt. Welcome, Casey. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So congratulations. I know that you recently received an NSF Career Award, which is titled Scaffolding Ethical Speculation in Technology Design. So in a nutshell, what is the focus of this research?
So the premise of this work is that a lot of technologists absolutely want to do the right thing and want to be thinking about ethics. And sometimes that can be difficult to do, in part because it requires considering future harms or unintended uses of technology. And so this project is intended to create strategies for helping people with that process of speculating about future ethical impacts or harms. And so some of the work is around how to help with those strategies. So analysis of past ethical controversies to look for patterns, some work with people from marginalized populations and considering future harms, and iterating on the structure of how to do that kind of speculation, both in the classroom and in industry practice. And so the eventual outcome will be like a toolkit that will include things like checklists and flowcharts and exercises and those sorts of things.
So that sounds great and very helpful. And related to that, I know that when in your interviews and in your abstracts, you're talking about a concept called ethical debt. So can you tell us more about what you mean?
Yeah, so actually the concept of ethical debt came from one of my current PhD students, Natalie Garrett, and this is part of the work that she's doing, and she's actually leading the work on looking at past ethical controversies. So the idea is that the concept of technical debt, which we hear a lot about in computer science, is that, yeah, we know that there's going to be some bugs, like we can only do so much testing, and we've got this release date and we got to hit it. So, we'll fix bugs later once we figure out what they are. And that can be okay if it's like, buttons in a wrong place, or hi, Catherine. Catherine and I used to be roommates. If the button's in a wrong place or something like that, no problem, right? But if the bug is like, oops, our social media platform undermined democracy, then it's too late at that point, right? So you need to be thinking about those kinds of potential bugs before they happen, because you can also accrue ethical debt. And so, I hadn't actually really been connecting those two things until I started writing this career proposal, and I was thinking about all the things that I was excited about and that my students were excited about, and I started sort of coalescing around these problems that I see, and one of them is ethical debt, and one of them is the way that we teach computer science education, or how we teach ethics in computer science education, which tends to be, sort of siloed, or at the end of a process rather than at the beginning. And so I started thinking about how one path towards improving both of those things was having this kind of ethical thought and ethical speculation at the very beginning of the design process, rather than, worrying about it later, thinking about it at the end.
So let's talk a little bit about the how, because kind of I'm convinced about the what. Let's teach kind of ethics. So what are some methods that we can use to teach ethics through speculation? And if you have examples of how we can use it in kind of intro courses and maybe kind of in other settings.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping to do is figure this out even better as I do this work. One sort of proof of concept thing is a teaching exercise that I've been using for a number of years that I call the Black Mirror Writer's Room. And I got the idea for this in part because when I teach a standalone tech ethics class, and the students were always so interested in talking about Black Mirror. Like, we'd start talking about, something in class and, oh, Dr. Fiesler, did you see this Black Mirror episode? And one of the things I thought was like, if you can get really excited and engaged in thinking about the ethical implications of like some technology that someone might create in 100 years, then like, why can't you channel that same kind of enthusiasm for thinking through the ethics of something, for the thing that you're going to build tomorrow? And so even though I don't think that the students taking my ethics class are actually going to be dealing with, for example, let's see, my students did this last week, and one of the examples they came up with were like drones used for like Instacart delivery services end up becoming weaponized by the US government. Like, I don't think that, that kind of thing is what they're actually going to be dealing with, but the kind of thought that they put into, okay, we have this technology right now, where might it go? And what would the implications be? I actually think that that is a really useful skill. It also jives with like some things that I think are important about education in terms of like creativity and creating artifacts and working in groups and that sort of thing. And so it's actually been working quite well. So one of the things that I'm trying to figure out now is, what does that look like for actually looking at like for something that you're actually building? And I mean, this is something that I have students do sort of informally, a fair amount. Like, I'm teaching a class on online communities this semester, and we did a like very basic, design a new online community kind of thing. And then like, how might this go wrong? Particularly in terms of like, what are the like negative user personas of this online community? And I think about this a lot because I was fascinated by Zoom bombing, because the CEO of Zoom did a interview with the New York Times where he was like, yeah, we never thought about this before. Like, it did not occur to us that someone could misuse our technology. And I was like, man, like, hindsight is 2020. But I gotta tell you, I feel like if someone had described Zoom to me and be like, yeah, the rooms are just based on these like 8-digit numbers and they're public and you could just like generate random ones, I would have been like, yeah, I feel like maybe some random people might go into Zoom rooms and like show people their genitals, because that is a thing that people do. And so I think that it's really important that, part of ethical speculation is actually, I think, having like antagonistic user personas, like not just, oh, we need the user persona for like the, stay-at-home mom in our online community and like the teenager who's going to use it, but also like abusive ex-partners who are stalking their exes. How are they going to use it? And then can you design to make that more difficult?
I love this idea, and I'm kind of learning and taking notes as we're speaking. I mentioned that I tried your Black Mirror exercise in class, and I noticed that it's easier for students to think about, big things and remote things that can go badly. So like the weapon examples, or, a world in which every individual is being tracked kind of 1984 style. But it's the most kind of trivial negative consequences that there is sometimes miss. And I think that these are very powerful examples, how kind of to think about the negative persona. So here I ask a kind of a more personal question, but my background is in CS. I was trained in kind of a computer science department. There was not much ethical discussion in the courses that I was taking. And sometimes I feel I would like to teach ethics in classes, but I'm not qualified, I'm not trained. So what is your advice for people that would like to kind of integrate more ethics into the CS curriculum, but are coming from technical training and disciplines?
So this is something that I've thought a lot about. And one thing that I'm doing, some work that my students and I are just spinning up is like understanding the barriers to this kind of integration. Like, what are the resources that folks like you think they might need in order to be able to do this? That said, I was actually just talking about this the other day with some folks, and they were like, well, you're saying that it's really important to like include ethics as part of a machine learning class, but like, what if the machine learning professor doesn't know anything about ethics? And I gotta tell you, my reaction to that question posed so directly was like, they should. Like, I actually find it very troubling if someone who is enough of an expert in machine learning that they teach a class on it, if they don't know the ethics of machine learning, that's a big problem. And I think part of the answer to that is like, you need to learn. And the other thing is, my hope is that now we will be creating experts who will, be that. So like if the graduate students who are taking machine learning now are getting exposed to ethics content, then when they become professors, they should be able to teach it. And so maybe it's sort of a slow thing like that. And in the meantime, I mean, it's not like, especially if we're talking about, for example, an undergraduate class, like it's not like we're expecting people to like teach traditional ethical theory in their machine learning class. Like, you don't need to read Kant. You just need to like talk to your students about bias and why it's bad and where it comes from, and also think about how bad people might use this, and also why like predictive inference is kind of creepy. And it's sometimes I feel like it's not as deep as people think it might need to be. And so I think it might be a little bit more of like a fear of like teaching it wrong somehow. But one of the things about teaching ethics is that it doesn't tend to be content-based. And like I've done analysis of a bunch of syllabi from tech ethics classes, and the learning objectives are almost never content-based. Like, it's not like our students must be able to recite the categorical imperatives. It's like be able to spot issues and think through problems and critique things, that sort of thing. And I actually think that students, like, it's not that I need them to know I consider it a win if students come out of a class, even an intro programming class, just being able to like realize that there are ethical issues in the kinds of things that they're doing, to be able to like spot things and seek out more expertise when they need it. And considering that there's like an ethical controversy in the tech industry like every day almost, I actually think that even just like talking about current events in classes is will get you part of the way there.
This is great, Casey, and I just kind of share the link to your kind of blog about what do we teach when we teach ethics.
Oh, great.
Because I think it's very nice to see this kind of syllabi analysis and be able to realize this is not about content. This is really about asking questions and debating. And I think that for me personally, kind of having people contributing and sharing their activities and their learning goals had been extremely helpful. So I want to kind of jump to a different topics, and then we'll kind of go to questions from the audience. But I just want to talk about your social media presence, and you're an influencer and you have a YouTube channel about graduate school and preparing for graduate schools in computing. So I'd love to hear more about this experience interacting with students and interacting with general audience.
Yeah, I've been joking lately about like my influencer money. I don't actually know what constitutes being an influencer, but I have made $65 from TikTok, so not quitting my day job. So I've been active on social media for a long time, particularly Twitter, and I talk a lot about public scholarship and why I think it's important, and why I think it's actually like for people like me who enjoy it. I actually think that it's useful for your like academic career. That said, I really do enjoy it. Like this is, I actually worked briefly in PR, and like tweeting is one of my favorite things. If you don't enjoy it and it feels like a chore, then it's probably not worth the time. Because as I tell people, like I'm not making YouTube videos in time that I should be, writing grant proposals or grading or whatever. Like for the most part, this is like a thing that I'm doing because I enjoy it. And so the fact that we were in a pandemic and I had more time than usual, in which I did not want to be working all the time, because I mean, as it's so hard to explain the sort of psychology of the pandemic, but like I was totally feeling completely burned out on work, and was having a lot of trouble concentrating and that kind of thing. And so I was trying to think of something that I could do that would be fun for me, but also feel kind of productive. And also importantly, like deal with the fact that like I really miss talking to people. And in particular, like one of my favorite things is giving advice to graduate students. And I have a good friend who is a young adult author and has an extremely successful YouTube channel in which she gives advice to writers. And she was talking to me and she's like, I've always really enjoyed telling people what to do in a positive, like in a sort of like to help them kind of way. And I was like, oh, I kind of feel that way about giving advice to grad students. So that's why I started the YouTube channel. And then like just the positive feedback that I was getting, and in particular, having videos with advice for PhD applications, because like I've been running admissions in my department since I started this job. And every year I'll see some applications where I'm just like, oh, no one told you how to do this. Like there's just all of these, I mean, not secret, but like things that if you're getting mentorship, you sort of know to do. I mean, even something as simple as like, if you're applying for a computer science PhD program, you need to be mentioning specific faculty in your statement of purpose. Like that might not be obvious. And so, I've gotten so many, especially over the past couple of months, like messages from people telling me like, you are the reason I got into a PhD program, which like probably isn't actually true, but it's very nice to hear. And then I got onto TikTok in part because I looked at my analytics on YouTube and my audience was mostly men and I couldn't figure out why. And so I thought, well, where could I go to like potentially reach more women? And so I started making TikToks with advice for PhD applicants. And then I just started making like a couple that were like about sort of tech ethics stuff, and then was really surprised when those were like what blew up on TikTok for me. And there's a lot of, I mean, I'm still kind of surprised by like the number of people who have not been exposed to, I don't know, the idea that technology is not neutral or that algorithmic bias exists, or that tech can be racist. And so it's actually quite a nice platform because I mean, it's 1 minute videos, right? And and there's a lot of people who haven't been exposed to even very simple concepts like that. And so, yeah, I think that part of the role of an academic is to not just create knowledge that's going to be like locked up in academia, but like why would you do something if it's not actually going to have an impact on the world? And so this has been one of the ways that I try to like have a broader impact on the world at large, and not just academics.
Casey, this is so much fun. So there are some questions that I wanted to introduce, and there are a couple of questions, and they're both about how exactly to go about getting information from outside to understand the ethical issues. So maybe Diana, you can start. And Diana, you also have a question about we've got the TikTok handle. All right, so that's resolved, but not the original question.
I do have two questions. I'm gonna ask this one first. So how do you bring user groups that students are developing for into the classroom environment? So I know how Orit does it in her HCI class. We sort of go on usertesting.com or something like Prolific, or not Amazon Mechanical Turk, but platforms like that to get user groups from that's there. We have to do user testing basically, so we could use those platforms. It was a little harder in a pandemic getting people in person, but how do you do that? Because obviously when thinking about ethical concerns, we have to think about users first, because that's who we're making these this technology for.
You know, I actually don't teach any classes myself that involve students designing things or building things or even designing things. And so I don't have to do this. However, this question makes me think of something slightly related. So, you know, I mentioned that one of the projects proposed in the career project is getting input from people from marginalized populations on future harms. And one of the reasons why I thought that was so important, you know, like I could give a whole spiel about why I think like diversity in the tech industry implicates ethics and harm. And the short version of that is like, you know, I mean, I don't know anything about the actual demographics of people who work on Zoom, but like, you know, who's really good at thinking about how technology might be used to harass people who get harassed a lot, and, you know, women and queer people and people of color, and like, oh, look, I just named everyone who's underrepresented in the tech industry. And so, you know, I don't think that sort of like diversify your design team is like the answer to everything or even ethics, but I certainly don't think it hurts. And, you know, I was thinking of sort of like, you know, if as part of this toolkit, it in part centers, you know, users from marginalized groups, like you know, at least then there's something that people can refer to, even if their team is not particularly diverse. And the other thing is, like, I've been thinking a lot about how a lot of this has to do with empathy, or like a lack of empathy, like the ability to appreciate harm to people who aren't like you. Because like I just constantly hear people say things like, well, that wouldn't have bothered me. Like an example is I did a TikTok about there was this research paper that was about like bias in image completion. And they had an example of AOC in a bikini. Like their algorithm, you know, great example, right? But hey, why did you have to use a real woman? And like, and so, you know, they ended up taking it out of the paper because there was some backlash about it. But like, I made a video about this, and someone male presenting commented and said, it wouldn't have bothered me if there was a picture of me in a bikini in the paper. And I was like, let's think about why that might be. Or, you know, similarly, like, well, you know, it wouldn't bother me to receive a death threat on Twitter. You know, just like this idea that you need to imagine how someone who's not you might be harmed by something, and how, you know, particularly since harms like disproportionately impact people who are already in vulnerable positions. And I do not know the solution to that problem. But I think it's something that we need to sort of be cognizant of, like that you don't need to be thinking about whether this would bother you, but whether, you know, it is. So I guess it's a sort of roundabout answer to your question. I think that it's very important that we're doing that. And I think this is also why a lot of people sort of see ethics as falling under the umbrella of HCI.
Well, thank you. This sort of leads into my next question. So I know you mentioned in your answer diversifying your teams, and I wonder if this kind of bias, ethics, like the issues you discussed, has ever been politicized, because there is a divide between certain groups saying, oh, why would you want to diversify your team? It doesn't make sense. And they turn into a political issue. I was reading this book, Automating Inequality, and there was one section that talked about how Indiana sort of transitioned their whole system, or tried to pilot a new system to automate like benefits, like Medicare benefits, and how it was a total disaster. But that was so politicized, you know, when this issue is very much about ethics and why you're getting a machine to tell people whether or not they should have benefits, and it became politicized. So has that ever happened to you? How do you deal with it? I know you must have dealt with it on TikTok. So, because I don't think this issue should be politicized.
Yeah, I mean, the challenges that I personally have in teaching in terms of like political or whatever, you know, tend to be more things around like, it's very difficult to talk about the current debates around content moderation without bringing in politics, because even, you know, and I tell my students, I'm like, there is no evidence that content moderation on social media is actually biased against conservative political thought. There is evidence that there is a correlation between content violations that are being removed and the political affiliation of but it's not like you know, Twitter is removing tweets like talking about how we need to lower taxes, right? And my hope is that there isn't a political party that that wants to say that their official political platform is hate speech. And similarly, you know, someone on TikTok actually asked me a question. They were like, I'm writing an essay for a class on AI bias, but my teacher said I'm not allowed to be political. So how can I write AI bias without being political? And I was like, why is AI bias political? What does it possibly have to do with politics? Like, it is a scientific fact. Like, there is evidence that, you know, some of these algorithms, facial recognition, etc., are biased, you know, based on race or gender, etc. Like, that is not in question. And my hope would be that there is not a political stance on not caring about disadvantaging people of a particular race. I hope, and so I find this very tricky. You know, when I teach ethics, I have a syllabus statement about like disagreement, and it basically says like, you know, some of the topics in this class are things that people might disagree on. You know, like people reasonably disagree on, you know, for example, censorship versus protecting people on a social media platform. And like, that's fine. You don't all have to agree. You might not agree with me. I try to surface my own biases or my own, like, you know, I tend to think this. I mean, for example, I talk a lot about copyright, like my dissertation was about copyright, and I cannot talk about copyright and pretend that I don't have like, you know, very negative feelings towards like big copyright owners in general. And so I just say that, and I'm like, it's fine. Like if you guys want to go work for the movie industry or whatever, like it's fine. It's not going to affect your grade. I'm just gonna, you know, tell you how I feel about it. But yeah, I really just like this notion that things like AI bias are political. I don't understand it personally. And so I think maybe, you know, explaining sort of the kind of thing that I just like explain to me why this is political. Like, what does this have to do with politics?
So Takis, if you want to follow up on this, I know Chris has a question about how we get to
I can
broad
wait.
enough. Okay,
can
so
wait.
if it's not connected, then let's go with Chris first. And Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. It's been really interesting to hear. And also I need to explore your social media and find more out about this Black Mirror writer room exercise, but that's afterwards. I was thinking about how do you know when you're at the right depth of sort of thinking about potential ethical consequences? So I think I guess I can compare it with qualitative research where you have some idea of now saturation has been reached. You know you haven't been that there will be more, but it's okay for now. But sort of with some of these ethical considerations, it's also a lot about imagining things that aren't there yet. So it seems like a very large challenge. So are there those similar strategies, or are there particular methods or strategies for tackling that on the ethics front?
I mean, I don't think you'll ever, I don't think you'll ever know, like, I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about it similarly to qualitative methods like, saturation or that kind of thing. I mean, I obviously do not expect, and no one should expect, for every product design team to somehow be able to anticipate every single future harm or type of bad actor. And I actually do think that sometimes people expect too much when it comes to that. I do think that occasionally when we have sort of, why didn't you think of that? I'm like, well, I mean, it is completely true that like, you shouldn't be expected to anticipate every single possible thing. But I so often see things that like, yeah, I feel like you should have learned from, something, that's happened in the past, for example. Or like, when I see things and I'm like, I think I know how that's gonna go. Like one example is when Twitter released like voice tweets, and there wasn't any like automatic transcription or anything that like would describe what it was. And I was like, people are gonna tweet just like pornography, like that. And I could think of some things that you might do about that, right? Like, again, automatic sort of captioning. And so if there's not any words, like maybe, make sure that you got your headphones on before you play that, or that kind of thing. Or like TikTok has this weird moderation kind of glitch. I don't know if it's a glitch, but like a sort of loophole around how they do blocking and what happens to comments of people that are blocked and this sort of thing. And that I think is quite harmful. And I'm like, you didn't think about this? Or, the book Design Justice has this example of a tweet, and I can't remember who the person who tweeted it was, but it was basically like, if you create a new social media network and it doesn't have the ability to block people like this moment you launch it, then like, that's how you know your social media network was designed by a white man. Because like, people who are harassed on social media a lot know how important it is to be able to block people. So I do think that there's some amount of kind of learning from the past, but I don't know how you ever know if you've sort of hit saturation of ethical issues. And I think, like, again, I'm happy when students come out of a class and are thinking about it. Like, I even just want people to like thinking about ethics as part of their job. So even that I consider a win, even if, we can't, I think we can't expect people to be sort of perfect right out of the gate.
That makes sense indeed. That I mean, there's never, truth is maybe out there, but it's definitely hard to identify and find. And I like this emphasis that you placed on the process and right from the start thinking about it, which is HCI at large, we try to convince people about it. And I think ethics is integral to that. But yeah, so thanks for the.
Also, since you
idea,
asked,
yeah.
I'll put a link in the chat to the Black Mirror.
Hooray!
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Takis, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you very much, Casey. As you realize that, I cut my walk short because I thought that this is something that I need to be in a more stable place. This has been very, very interesting, fascinating. It's something that I kind of worry on a daily basis. And it is very frustrating to be a teacher in computer science and try to teach ethics for many of the reasons you mentioned as well. I'm not an expert, and I may never be an expert because ethics has a lot to do with local knowledge and habits. So Wellesley, Massachusetts is very, very different than, Mongolia, let's say. And if I say something and is read by somebody in Mongolia, they may find it insulting and unethical. So even legal, it's kind of tricky. Legal is much clearer what it is, but what is not legal is not very clear. But nevertheless, in my experience as a computer science professor, I found this kind of disheartening fact. It is about writing code correctly, but I think it applies in thinking about ethics in the future. So I happen to have worked in a medical startup years ago. And my job was to make sure that the product that the company was producing would actually pass FDA approval. So, I'm a theoretical computer scientist, so I actually got into the trouble of making sure that everything was working correctly. So when I'm teaching my introductory course, I tell the students that it is important that when you write code, you test it correctly. And of course, initially students would not be that interested because, when you try to get your program to work, to think about all the possible data input that your program would fail is extremely challenging. So to try to, get them to think that, no, it is important that you test your programs correctly, I tell them about my experience. I say, imagine that the code you write is not about, your CS course assignment, but it is about writing medical code, which might have effect on people. And I thought that this is pretty cool and pretty motivating. I could not see anything wrong with that until I saw my most conscious students feeling really, frustrated. And they explained to me that, look, if what I write can have this implication, I would never be ready to actually write code. I would never be able to turn in the assignment because the code I might be writing might affect somebody's life. So the people that I want mostly to inspire might be kind of more, not interested in actually doing computer science because they're thinking like what I do could have major implications. Years ago, 100 or so years ago, when we had the first cars, which was, kind of a cart without a horse, we were not thinking about automatic braking systems so that, if there is a human detected, the carts of 1900 would actually try to brake and steer away, stuff like that. If we were to do that, we would never have created cars. It took like more than 100 years to go there. So should we take into account that we really need to enable people to produce code while telling them that, this is more complicated than that, but without discouraging them by telling them all the possible implications? It becomes like a nightmare. Sorry for the long introduction. I wanted to, put it in some context.
I mean, that's interesting. I haven't heard that exact sort of thing before, that like students could become so paralyzed by worrying about their impact on the world that they are afraid to write any code. I mean, I gotta tell you, my initial reaction to this is maybe like, good. I mean, I actually think that it's good if people are considering the impact that they might have on the world. I mean, but like, you know, and those students that you're talking about, you know, I would think that they would, you know, they should know that the code they're actually writing for class is obviously not being used in medical equipment, et cetera. And that if they go, you know, work for, you know, a company that's doing, I don't know, database software for auto parts stores, that like they're not going to have, you know, that kind of issue. Like to me, I guess I honestly maybe feel a little bit similarly to Peter in the chat. Like maybe that is a better problem than no one cares, than no one cares. You know, that's what I think. This brings up a larger issue of like, I do think I do want to, you know, make it clear that like the idea here is not to stifle innovation. Like I actually want, like, I think the purpose of thinking through ethical implications during the design process is so that you're able to mitigate them as best you can, in order to encourage innovation. Like you should be building things and you should be thinking, and you should be doing your, you know, your best to prohibit as much potential harm as possible. I mean, this is a much simpler example, but like some of the early research I did in my faculty career was looking at the ethical implications of using tweets in research. And like our intention in doing this work was not to tell people that they should not use tweets, right? Like people come after me with pitchforks. The idea was, if you are going to use tweets in research, you know, without people's consent, et cetera, here are the things that you should be thinking about to do that the most ethically and to prevent potential harms and to respect people's privacy, et cetera. And my hope then being that this encourages more people to do that work who might have been concerned about the ethical implications, potentially. I mean, this is so complex and also extremely context dependent, right? So yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be a really important conversation in the years to come, like this tension between like preventing harm and innovation. And I don't have answers for like how to do that, but I do think that students thinking about that tension themselves is actually a really important thing that they should be learning to do. And I do think that, you know, I mean, consider how like doctors feel about this. I'm sure a lot of people decide not to go to medical school because they're afraid of like hurting, because they know that they're like putting, you know, lives in their hands. Or even like lawyers, I could ruin someone's life if if they're innocent and I'm a bad lawyer and they go to jail. And I'm kind of comfortable with technologists having similar kinds of feelings. And so, yeah, I would encourage students to think about how to grapple with that themselves.
Thank you, Takis, and thank you, Casey.
Thank you.
And I think that we could continue this discussion for a while. I'm going to kind of ask Catherine to speak, and then we will wrap up the formal part and we will continue the informal. Catherine.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that, Casey. I wanted to ask, kind of tapping into your love of giving advice to students, for these classes that you teach on different on ethics, or say online communities, or that tap into these types of exercises. What if you have a student coming to you saying, Casey, I love thinking about this. This is what I want to do. How do you pave a career path that's focused on doing that, then specifically focused on like software engineering?
Oh, that's such a good question. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, in part because I've actually gotten this question a lot on TikTok. Like, what if I want to do this for my career? So the good news is I do think that there are kind of increasingly jobs that are like this. I can also, or actually if someone wants to Google this and find it, because I think I just have to Google it. The All Tech is Human has like I think it's called like the Responsible Computing Job Board or something like that. All Tech is Human has a job board for like ethics related jobs in tech. And so there are jobs that are like this. And I hope there'll be more. And I think, and I do think that actually students who have both technical skills and who deeply understand these sorts of social and ethical issues are going to be increasingly in demand in coming years. And so I would encourage students to like continue their computer science degree, for example, especially if that's where they started. And don't, I wouldn't encourage them to like switch your major to philosophy so that you can be an ethicist. That said, and I once had a Twitter thread where I asked a bunch of people's advice on this issue. And one of the responses that I thought was really important was like, well, on the one hand, yes, it would be great to have like, jobs that have ethics in the title to like, for students like this, but also like, I want all of these students to be doing the jobs they would have been doing otherwise, and being those people who care deeply about ethics in those technical jobs. And so I agree with that as well. Like, I mean, so one thing is like, you don't have to choose. Like you can go be a software engineer and be thinking deeply about ethics and be like the smart person on the team who like is talking about this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I kind of feel like both of those things are potentially viable. And I love to see students who are increasingly interested in these kinds of things. And then of course, for those who are really interested, I think there are a lot of options for like graduate school to sort of delve into these things more than they might get in an undergraduate degree.
And so maybe just pushing a little bit more on the practicality of it, do you have recommendations for students who would like to find a job where say they're a software engineer and they can contribute to these types of questions, of something to say add on their resume or something to ask during the interview process?
I'm glad you brought up the interview process, actually. Yeah, I do think that this is something that you can ask about at interviews, which is things, I mean, sort of like, what are the values of your company? How are people in roles like this thinking about the ethical implications of what they're building? Are there processes in place to consider the ethical implications, those sorts of things? I actually think, I don't know, I've been saying this a lot lately, and I wonder if it's a little bit of naive, I don't know. But I feel like if a lot of students start doing this, I feel like it could actually have an influence on tech companies. Like, I think that one of the things they're really concerned about is losing good talent. And if a bunch of like really good applicants start coming in and grilling them about the values of their company and how they think about ethics, and then taking jobs with places that have better answers, like, I don't know, maybe that could actually have an impact. So I do, I actually kind of want to do some research on this. So like, maybe I'll have some actual answers in terms of like, what are some things you could ask at job interviews? But I love that idea. I mean, and also, emphasizing on your resume that you have, that, well, and it's interesting to think about what that might be. Like, would it be listing a class that you've taken on ethics, for example, might be one option. Students who come to me and like really, really want to get involved, usually I'm like, well, you can come be an RA in my lab and do ethics research. So like, if there are faculty who do research related to ethics, like that could actually be the best thing that a student who's super, super into it could possibly do.
Thank you, Casey. I feel that we could continue this conversation for a while, but I'm going to wrap up the formal part. And thank you again for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Next week, we'll have Stacy Branham from University of California, Irvine joining us, and she'll be talking about innovating the future of work with blind people.